Hello and welcome back to my channel. I just saw a thing on Facebook where somebody was talking about anniversaries in Doctor Who. It was a kind of a meme thing, and they pick up on when people were born or when things were released or when things were broadcast. And they said that it's 24 years exactly today, 14th of May, that Big Finish recorded the Stones of Venice with Paul McGann and India Fisher in the year 2000, 24 years ago, which was my first Doctor Who script for Big Finish. I'd written, by that point, about 3 novels for them. So I was a seasoned Doctor Who person, but this was my first performed Doctor Who, apart from one short story for BBC Audio, which is a different story. This was my first drama, my first actual episodes. And Gary Russell was the producer then, who had asked me at a kind of launch party that Big Finish did in 1999 to write a story for them, to pitch to Tom Baker, which never happened at the time, although there was a happier outcome about 10 years later when I wrote for him for BBC Audio. Anyway, back then, they realised they couldn't get Tom. I was outlining this story, The Stones of Venice, about a future Venice which is sinking into the sea and is filled with amphibious people, fish people, who are taking people away and drowning them. There's a kind of an eternal love story with the Duke and his Duchess, a kind of a gothic Hinchcliffe story, really. That's what I was working on. Then they were after Paul McGann to come back and reprise his role, and my script was the one given to him to try and bring him into the fold and join the other Big Finish Doctors. And so he did. And anyway, I've got out my box of Big Finishers, 24 years worth. It's kind of bittersweet because it's a lot of work, and I do think that's a lot of stuff. And maybe at one point it was kind of 1 a year I was doing. So it adds up. I haven't done anything for a while, and it's kind of bittersweet because I've asked in a couple of times in the last couple of years. I've offered my services, as a freelance. I need the work, and I've been told by the fella in charge there, Nick, that they don't want me. They'd offered me up to the various producers there, and they didn't want what I do. So that's that, I guess. Anyway, I thought I would talk through some of the things I've worked on, and maybe with a touch of nostalgia and bittersweetness, or maybe celebratory. It's my celebratory episode. 24 years of. It's a bit dusty, the Stones of Venice, fittingly. People always bring these to be signed and want to talk about them. The people who like these things aren't the ones who collect things in cellophane and boxes and just get the thing signed and have them on their shelves. These are fans who listen and listen again and know all about it. And by the time they come and see you, you've forgotten as the writer what goes on in these things. That's my Stones of Venice, which has the most amazing soundscape. I was astonished by this, playing it on big speakers. When it arrived in 2001 in the house, our house in Norwich then, my friend Ollie was around. Ollie, who was a wonderful writer. For radio, it turned out. He went into radio and knew all about it. At this point, he was a friend of mine in Norwich, an ex-student. He died last year, Ollie. He was a wonderful writer. He died very, very young, and he was only in his 40s. Anyway, I remember sitting listening to my first Doctor Who with McGann, with Ollie, and he said, "You've made Doctor Who talk just like you." But his delight in what I was doing was what I remember. That's much more recent, the Peterloo Massacre. I say recent, it's probably 2016. It's 8 years ago. This is the one where they told me everyone's sick of the kind of camp, comic, metafictional crap that you usually do. The kind of people got this idea that I always do these crazy ones that are full of fantasy and a certain amount of camp. So I thought, right, I'll do something quite different. And I wrote about the Peterloo massacre in Manchester. And I did my research in Manchester Central Library in town, reading all this stuff about this terrible moment in Manchester history. And I wrote bits of it on the actual site. The library is more or less right by St. Peter's Fields, as they were, where the private constabulary rode over the protesting crowds and trampled them to death. And I put the doctor, Nissa and Tegan, and their new friends that they make in 1819 in the middle of all of that, and produced some very harrowing scenes, and got them to act their socks off. Sarah Sutton, at the end of whatever it is, episode 3, is astonishing, and so is, well, they all are. And when I went to a Doctor Who convention in 2018, I think, in Baltimore, I was standing at the luggage pickup thing in the airport with Sarah Sutton and Janet Fielding, who I'd never met before. And so by way of introduction, I said, well, I have written for you for Big Finish, and I wrote one for you and gave you lots to do in the Peterloo Massacre, and one for Janet Fielding, giving her lots to do in the Lady of Mercia, where she is mistaken for the daughter of a warrior queen in whatever it is, 11th century England. I can't see the Lady of Mercia. There it is. What was nice about these, this is a few years before, another kind of historical one, what they call a pseudo-historical one, because it involves science fiction elements. This is what they call pure science, a pure historical. These are terms derived from early TV Doctor Who, where you'd get stories where they arrive and they're caught up in the grinding wheels of history. And Hartnell's Doctor would say, we can't change anything, we are squished under the wheels of history. And you'd see that in the Aztecs or the Crusades. Then you'd have the pseudo-historicals, where you'd have someone like the time meddler, the meddling monk, messing about with history, and science fiction elements coming in. And as time went on for the TV show, that became the norm. If you went into history, you had to have science fiction-y things to sweeten the heaviness. Although I don't think there's anything heavy about historical stories. I think they're exciting and full of character. 2013, The Lady of Mercia. These two topped the poll, or came second and third of the best Peter Davison stories for Big Finish, when the Radio Times ran a poll a number of years ago, which was delightful because it was the fans and listeners voting. It wasn't the hardcore people who comment on everything all the time. It was the people who, the bigger audience who listen. Not that the audience is massive, but it's still bigger than just the hardcore of people who comment online. I always remember Gary Russell saying that years and years ago, that you have to remember that the people who rush to say things online are a small proportion of the audience that actually is sitting at home enjoying what you do. Anyway, I love doing these two. I love doing the historical stuff. Yeah, I offered to write them a box set because they were so popular, of historical stories, but they actually didn't reply. Another historical one, maybe the last full-length one I did, the Muse of Fire. I'd never written a full one for Sylvester McCoy before, and I paired him with Ace and Hex, Philip Oliver and Sophie Aldred, and then through Katie Manning as Iris and David Benson as Panda into the mix in 1920s Paris amongst all the artists, with lots of little cameos by people like Dali, chucking his paintings in the river. Yeah, it's a nice atmospheric one, again, and lovely music. What else? That's a more recent thing. The Jack Rayner is somebody who's kept faith with me as a writer since the very beginning, since she worked for BBC Audio right at the start when I was doing, BBC Books and Audio, when I was doing my early Doctor Who books, and so she was aware of all my things. And then when she became a producer in recent years, did this multi-box set series for Colin Baker's Doctor, and got me to write a story called The Mindless Ones, which was a kind of a riff on the old Faceless Ones story, but a joke really about the well-being and mindfulness industry as it is. It's a pretty savage satire, or I think, on the kind of pseudo psychological bollocks that we currently got in the world, the kind of sentimental nonsense of self-help. Anyway, what else? There's loads of them. There's another Muse of Fire. This was a series that we did, one of the later Iris Wildtime series. I got my own spin-off that had a kind of slightly rackety career. And this was the most recent box set, which was quite nice. Lots of writers I like in this. I wrote one where I brought Panda into it, or an alias of Panda. I do think it was a mistake to take Panda out of an Iris story. Once we had Panda there, he's a perfect foil for Katie's Iris, and I think you remove him at your peril, really. But it was an experiment. This was the second one I did in 2001. I think it came out in 2002. And it's a kind of Lord of the Rings story with zombies and warlords and nuns and a double-decker bus and zombies. Have I mentioned the zombies? Anthony Stewart Head's in it, and it's the first time that I wrote for Peter Davison's Doctor, but it's the first time that Katie came in as Iris. And so it's a revelation. And I always remember, again, Gary Russell phoning me up here in Manchester in 2001 and saying, Iris is mad, isn't she? I've got an idea about who could play her. And we've never looked back. Katie became Iris forever. And she's been doing that now for 24 years or so. And here she is again. Find and Replace was one of the Companion Chronicles series where you had a smaller cast, something much more focused on the storytelling, on the mechanics of storytelling. That's what that series was about. It wasn't just one voice telling a story. It was about playing with the conventions of storytelling. And in Find and Replace, we have Katie playing both Iris and Joe. And she is kind of taken up by this terrible creature called Huxley, who's a novelizer, who latches onto her like a kind of storytelling leech to take all her stories away. It was a villain I invented for these particular stories. And I was there for the recording of this, rarely. They didn't often, because I live elsewhere, I wasn't around to go to recordings much, but I went down to see this and I was amazed that Katie did the whole thing with veering between different voices. They weren't separate takes. She became one character, then another. It was fascinating to watch, a lot of fun. That's a one-off episode in an anthology for Peter Davison and Mark Strickson, The Memory Bank, a kind of fairy tale story. Here's another Katie and Katie playing both Joe and Iris story, the Elixir of Doom set in old school Hollywood with kind of old school monsters chasing them about. Here's one that I did, right, The Boy That Time Forgot, 2008. And my idea was that it would be a kind of like a Doug McClure monster movie, the kind of At the Earth's Core type story, mixed with a bit of Bloomsbury, kind of Virginia Woolf kind of vibe. And it was about the afterlife of Adric. How would he survive? What would he become? And he was going to be king of the spiders, and it got changed into, I think, locusts or something. And we have a lovely turn we have some amazing turns in this. Andrew Sachs playing the elderly Adric, Harriet Walter, Adrian Scarborough. This was about 2008, about the same time as I did another, The Wishing Beast, for Colin Baker, Bonnie Langford and Jean Marsh. Another very fairy tale-ish story I did about dragons and people living inside dragons and old witches who fly around with kind of cosmic hoovers, I think, on this asteroid. Very dark underneath, of course, as fairy tales are. What I was aware of was this one ruined my Christmas 2007 with rewrites. I'm very good at rewrites. I'm very assiduous, and do everything I'm told and take it all to heart too much, I think, and work like mad. I've never missed a deadline in my life. Can you believe it? Everyone I know has missed deadlines. I'm just, you know, scared of letting people down. But what happened with these was that a lot of comments came from a lot of different people, and they were slightly sweeping. I do remember that it was about the time of Russell T Davies's Writer's Tale, and I thought, oh, they're doing rewrites like he demands. Just, you know, everybody ripping things out and pitching things in and patching it together, and I felt it kind of being pulled away from me. And rewrites being done the night before recordings and things. I remember there was an emergency to do with Colin Baker not wanting to play the Doctor as harshly as he'd been on TV, which when I'd been asked to write it that way. And my script was rewritten the night before, I think, without me knowing it, I think. So that's kind of when you feel that you don't own a script. You know, that might happen in Hollywood and stuff, but something so small scale and intimate and handmade as these things, where a writer's voice really does, or really should, count for something. I know I listen to Doctor Who stuff, I read Doctor Who stuff for the voices of the writers as much as the actors. And I did feel then that it was being pulled away and managed by lots of different hands. Lots of jokes that I wouldn't have made were coming in. And extra complicated plot beats that I wouldn't have put in. Anyway, that's just a kind of technical thing, I hope, of interest, really. It's all a while ago. I'm sure they don't do things like that now, but at the time it felt very kind of stressful, to be honest. Ringpool World was one of my Turlo stories, another companion chronicle, which is very twisty and storytelling. It's about the nature of storytelling, and so there are bits in the future tense, there are bits in the second person, all the things you're not meant to do, really. I had a go at. As usual, I don't know why I don't make things easier for myself. It would be easier just to write a story that was a runaround with people hiding, people being shot at and taken prisoner, and involving recognisable tropes and characters. That would be easier. I never make it easy for myself. I don't know why. These are two special ones to me, I think. When Doctor Who came back in 2005, Big Finish started to do to alter the shape of their 8th Doctor series, and they gave him episodes that were similar lengths and shapes to TV kind of episodes, and pretty starry casts each time. And these went out on Radio 7, I think it was called then. It's now Radio 4 Extra. I remember this one going out in January 2007, the very day that I was going to Cardiff to talk to people there about doing a tie-in book for the 3rd David Tennant season. I did Sick Building. And I remember saying, you know, I hope Russell listens to this futilely. Listens to this on the radio and hears how brilliant it is. Anyway, it is brilliant. It's set in a motorway services cafe in 1974, a place where all the glam rockers stopped by to have fry-ups in the middle of the night, as they apparently did in real life. All the glam rock stars would see each other on the road between gigs. Anyway, this is a motorway services that gets snowed in. You've got flesh-eating wombles outside, killing everybody that goes outside. You have aliens coming through the ether who you get channeled through a stylophone played by a young singer. It's high camp, and it has songs. It has a song sung by Stephen Gately, and it's just got, you know, this is a cast where you have not just Paul McGann and Sheridan Smith, you've got Bernard Cribbins and Eunice Stubbs acting their hearts out. Although I do remember it's spoiled slightly by Bernard Cribbins in the interview at the end saying that the lunch they had was better than the script, which I know is a throwaway joke, but after being so excited about it, I was a bit... it was like, great. Sometimes as the writer you feel a bit done down, I suppose, a bit kind of, last in the queue. Like there's a massive load of writers behind you who could do this stuff, and so you don't feel valued. That's the word. The next year I did another Paul McGann, Sheridan Smith one, The Zygon Who Fell to Earth, set in the Lake District, about Auntie Pat, who has ineluctably, we think, married a Zygon in disguise. Although I think we find out that she knows, as wives often do. It was going to be called Trevor of the Zygons, which is my preferred title, but I think they felt that was a pun too far. Horror of Glam Rock is my favourite title ever. This one had a lovely cast as well. Stephen Pacey from Blake 7, but it also had Tim Brooke Taylor, which is hilarious. There's a scene where he's a Zygon and he's suckling milk from a Scarasson, as we found out in the old TV show. That's how they lived, on the shores of Lake Buttermere or whatever it is. And Lucy, the companion, is watching through the bushes as this Scarasson expresses its milk into the mouth of a Zygon, and played by one of the goodies, and she starts vomiting. I love the fact that scene went out on Radio 7. That's really funny. But it's, these are the things that aliens would do. They'd have to do. I think that's all of them. I'm going through these, but some of these are kind of BBC ones, or Bafflegab. I think that's all my Doctor Who's for Big Finish. Wild Time at Large. No, there's one. That's one. This was the first of the Iris spin-offs. The first time we had her in a show with Panda. The back is introduced by Panda. Yeah, Happy Days. That's now 19 years ago. I remember getting... I'd not heard any of it, and then I got the actual discs sent to me very early one morning in 2005. We put the disc on the hi-fi downstairs, big speakers, very early in the morning before I went out to work, and these booming voices. And it was the first time we heard David Benson playing Panda, and he played him exactly right, just as Katie had played Iris from the beginning. These are going back in the box. I don't really re-listen to myself. Oh, the Wormery. Somehow I'm missing the Wormery, which was the story that Katie did in kind of 1930s Berlin as Iris with Colin Baker. I hope I haven't lost my copy. That looks as if I have. I shall have to look for that, I suppose. But I rarely re-listen to myself. I thought I always would. But you don't. You move on into the next stories. Kind of hoping that there's going to be further stories. Anyway, maybe 24 years is enough of that. I think I did the combinations of characters that I wanted to do. I really wanted to write more for Tom. I did those stories for BBC Audio that we got him back for, the Nest Cottage stories. But I would have loved to have done one of the, It's Saturday Tea Time 1978. Because that was when I was 8. That's when I watched Doctor Who first. But they never asked me, for whatever reason, all those stories with Tom. And I was kind of not in that gang, which is a shame. But never mind, I did a lot for them, and I'm grateful and happy about that. Anyway, that's my Doctor Who audio life, or part of it. My other Doctor Who audio life is with BBC Audio, and that's a different story again. But this is enough for this episode, and I'll see you again soon in another episode. Goodbye.